The early days of the PlayStation saw many experimental titles be launched to the masses, many of which were well received, with newer gaming audiences taking full advantage of the new concepts of this ever-growing console. The first few months more particularly were a very interesting time for the development and the growth of the PlayStation, with a varying mix of different types of titles from racing, futuristic racing, extreme sports, fighting games, platformers, action-adventure games, and everything in between, many of which would span multiple sequels that would go on to be popular franchises in their own right. And one of the games that we'll be looking at in this video that stems all the way back to the early months of the PlayStation's launch period is ESPN Extreme Games. That was released for the PlayStation in North America in September 95, Europe in December 95, and later in Japan in early 96, and it also got a port onto the Windows PC or MS-DOS in 1996 as well. The game would also be renamed to One Extreme due to the ESPN license expiring for Sony a short time later. But this game fitted in with the unique aspect of the early months of the PlayStation that showcased many innovative ideas and very unusual styles of games that would appeal to a variety of different players. Some of these games people didn't even know that they would enjoy them, but ended up finding a lot of place for them in their games catalogue or library. From the get-go of ESPN Extreme Games, it is apparent that there's a lot of influences taken from other racing games that were released by other developers. One of the most notable visual styles is that of Road Rash, that was also released on the PlayStation in and around that time, that was developed by Electronic Arts, and that style is very reflective, with the backgrounds and environments being in somewhat 3D aesthetics, but the sprites of the characters were all in 2D. And very like Road Rash, while you were racing you had the ability to punch and kick your opponents and knock them off their vehicles or other means of transport in order to gain an advantage throughout the race, but you also must adhere to various environmental obstacles while also trying to contend with other opponents trying to stop you from progressing as well. It just pretty much plays and feels like Road Rash, but with more of an extreme sports type of aesthetic, where you do race as guys like on rollerblades, mountain bikes, even more so like skateboards and other various types of transport, each have their own preferences and unique control aesthetics that will suit a variety of different players. Now the game does give access to 6 different courses that relate anywhere from Italy to like San Francisco and other areas within the American region, and you also have voice clips or video clips from a broadcaster as well that is displayed after most of the races, where they will give you words of encouragement or point out criticism, as you will definitely see a lot if you lose races, which will happen pretty much very regularly in this game. As honestly, this is an extremely tough game. Don't let the name fool you. This is a very tough game to win races in. The computer AI is so aggressive that they're leaps and bounds ahead of you before you can even catch up. And let's just put it this way, with the announcer you will hear the negative side effects telling you how bad you are at the end of each race, and you will experience that all for yourself for every race that you will lose.
Some people would be embarrassed by a run like that. You probably won a freaking trophy. A little advice for next time: try finishing ahead of the other racers.
But as we're going back to play this game, yes, I did lose a lot of races. I'm not going to deny that. It's still as tough as I remember. But after a bit of practice, finally I did get to win one race. And guess what happened? No sign of the announcer at all. So no words of encouragement, no sense of achievement, no nothing. I suppose I expected as much. Complete silence. Or in this way I see it, complete peace. But it is what it is. I decide to go on and move on to the next race, but again the same thing happens. I lose that, and guess what happens? She suddenly appears again, telling you how bad you are. So I'm like, yeah, this seems to be the train of motion for this video.
Congratulations, we have a new definition for slow. You!
But aside from that, yes, it does have its gripes. It is a tough game to master, but it has some addictive qualities that, funny enough, you will find yourself playing for quite a while. There's just something fun about doing tricks and jumps, trying to find secret hidden locations on each of the maps, as some of the areas that you will race on do have hidden tracks or routes that you can take that you can use to increase your score. So you have to hit likes of different gates along your journey. Some of them are on the ground while others are up in the the air or up on ramps, so you have to time everything almost to perfection in order to get through them. And the majority of them will end up allowing you to earn money so that you can again upgrade your character's attributes and gain access to better equipment and so forth. So there's enough challenges in each race that you must adhere to in order to get the best out of the experience. I suppose in many ways with all of those aspects, and considering it was a very early title on the PlayStation, the reception it got was very well received. That a year into the game's release, it was reported that the game was one of the biggest selling games, or one of the biggest selling Sony published games more specifically, on the PlayStation worldwide at the time, which was a massive achievement in itself. While many reviewers did like all of the aspects, or many of the aspects of the game, especially with the likes of the combat, they just criticised the game just for being somewhat overly difficult in many ways. But it didn't stop them from wanting to play. But it didn't stack up with many other racers that were on the system in terms of the variety of elements that were available. Like at that point we had the likes of Destruction Derby, we had Ridge Racer, we had Wipeout, and they set the standard pretty much for what would move forward with racing games on the system. And as we all know, those series were massive on the console and are still as popular today in many respects. But ESPN Extreme Games offered something a little bit different. If you wanted to move away from your typical arcade racers, this provided elements of racing but also provided elements of something different that would have been reflective of, like, say, Road Rash and other games. So it gave a very unique mix of styles that would have suited to a different dynamic of player for its time. But I think with timing, as with everything, I think a lot of these games, and this here was a perfect example of this, the timing was right for this game to come out. While it did have 2 sequels and were considered fairly decent, but they didn't catch on the same way that this game did in many ways, because at that point there was other types of games that were coming out, and games were starting to be developed in 3D, and games just in general were evolving by the time the sequels came out, and in many ways they were overlooked and literally just outclassed in most respects. And unfortunately that just happens. Some of these franchises, just while they do have some unique ideas, they just kind of just fall behind with the plethora of other titles that are pretty much being released at the time. But the first game was definitely a success due to its timing, because for many of us probably the most experimental period of the early days of the PlayStation was definitely during its first year of its release. So games like this here suited to so many different dynamics of players. Even people that wouldn't have been into extreme sports or even completely aware of it would have enjoyed this, and this game in many ways would have brought light to that genre or that sport in general. A lot of people would have taken up the role or taken on like mountain biking or even getting into skateboarding or other means of extreme sports activities just from playing this game alone. So it definitely contributed to the success of the sport in many ways for its time. Had it been released later, it probably wouldn't have done as well, but like I said, it came out at the right time. It really just was a case of the right place at the right time, as with many other early titles released on the PlayStation, which is why it's still held in high regard as one of the more popular early games seen on the system for that reason alone. But when we look back, yes, it hasn't aged well, but really when we think about it, it's not really such a bad thing, because the unique style of the game and the graphics, the visuals, it was very reflective of its time, and it was essentially perfect for its time in many ways, as it just stood out as something different that hadn't really been seen in games at that time, and because of its different nature also added to its success overall, and would still see popularity for quite a few years on the console in many respects. But when we look at the long plethora of extreme sports games that did come out on the system, and let's just put it this way, there was a lot, way more than I ever expected, as I'm still finding new games all the time. A lot of them all contribute their ideas and success mainly to the success and the quirky aspects of this game. So like I said, these early games on the PlayStation definitely contributed a lot to the overall future success of the console and the games that came with it. It was just an interesting time to be a gamer, really, overall. Like I always say, going back to understanding and coming off the back of the transition from playing games on 16-bit or 8-bit consoles with the Sega Master System, Mega Drive, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, then to come on to this era of gaming with the likes of the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Let's just put it this way, we'll never experience that change again, because with modern systems we've become very accustomed to the visual aesthetics and kind of like the requirements of what we want and need, and because there's so much of that available now, we nearly always know what to expect. And I don't know about you, but for me, I feel like that feeling is gone and we'll never get that back again. This was a one and only time that we'll ever get to experience that, to see something completely different that had never been witnessed before, and these games contributed to that overall experience. Because yes, modern games in many ways are beautiful, visually stunning, and yes, there are companies that are trying to dive into the catalogue of old ideas to try and reflect and trying to capitalise on the success of older games, and while they do a good job and they do capture that essence to some degree, it just comes at a time when there's a plethora of other types of games out there that just completely overshadow them. Whereas during this generation, all of these quirky and obscure games had a massive opportunity to shine, and they did so in abundance. So that's why for me personally, I consider this to be the best era of games, because that transition is something that we will never experience again. Never to that degree, because we were amazed by seeing things like this. We didn't know what to expect because we didn't know what was coming. So every experience that we got with either the PlayStation or the Sega Saturn was an entirely new and unique experience all on its own, and it's something that will last a lifetime, that in many modern cases with modern games we just won't get that anymore. But it's interesting to revisit these titles all the same. I think they are worth revisiting. Yes, they're tough and they're clunky by today's standards, but if you grew up with them, you'll still appreciate and respect them just as much today as you did when you were younger, as do I. So for that reason alone, I do think that it is worth going back to check out these games every now and then. While times are different, but we can still relive those memories, as they bring us back to times that were truly unique, that, like I said, it was a one-time only deal that we will never see again. But I would love to know your thoughts of ESPN Extreme games for the PlayStation. What did you think of it back in the day? Was this one of the titles you got during the early days of the PlayStation? And what did you think of it overall? Did you enjoy these obscure and quirky style games that were released back during the early months of the console? Or what other games did appeal to you back then? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other obscure and quirky extreme sports games that were also released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.